Tick, tick, tick. Are we getting closer to a countdown clock to war with Iran? Are we about to see the war in the Middle East expand to yet another front? Israel's already self-proclaimed that it's on a 7-front war, but the seventh of those, Iran, is still so far just a couple of tit-for-tat missile strikes. It has not yet broken out into all-out warfare. We're going to bring on Rajan Menon, one of my colleagues at Defense Priorities, and also the professor emeritus at City College of New York to help us unpack some of this stuff. Raj, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Danny.
Listen, I want to, before just leaping right into the Iranian part, one of the things I think is so important that we have the opportunity to do in a deep dive show like this that they don't get like on TV, and that is to put things in context. And you know, so much focus has been, of course, on Hamas and in the Gaza Strip, and then on to Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc. But there's another facet of this, which is also illustrative of kind of why we're in this place in the beginning. And that is in the context of time. I want to show you something that Marwan Bishara said this. I think it was yesterday regarding how Israel got to the place where it's at right now. World, I know this is going to be crazy to some people and probably going to shock you, but world history didn't start on October 7th of last year. No, I'm serious. And he's going to point out here that a lot of this stuff was decades in the making, and he's going to focus here not so much on the Palestinian issue and how they got to where they were, but how Israel got to where it is. Watch this.
You know, an Israeli guru some 50 years ago, Yeshayahu Leibovich, one of the most important figures in Israel's history, a philosopher, a chemist, and so on and so forth, predicted 50 years ago that if Israel continues to occupy Palestine, what's going to happen is that Israeli soldiers are going to turn to Israeli Nazi soldiers. That's coming from a religious, philosophical scholar in Israel, one of the most respected people in Israel. He predicted then, 50 years ago, if you continue to occupy the land that you invaded and occupied in 1967, you will become Nazis. You have to be careful. You have to withdraw sooner than later. Unfortunately, the Israeli government did not exactly take his advice on board. They've deepened the occupation, and they hence became more violent, more extreme, more fanatical, and more fascist.
And that's where I wanted to jump that off there. What do you say to that when you hear Marwan Bishara saying that Israel is becoming more fascist? Because any insinuation, especially anywhere in the West, that Israel is acting in any way like a Nazi kind of thing, that immediately gets all the defensive force fields up and rejects the argument whole cloth. How do you view that?
First of all, Danny, Yeshayahu Leibovich is an extraordinary person. He was both somebody who was committed to living in a Jewish state, but also clear-eyed about seeing some of the problems that lay ahead in front of it. And I think his basic point, if we can set aside the Nazi part for a moment, is that if you continue the occupation, Israel, it will do something profound to you. And I think what has happened is that the failure to deal with the Palestinian desire for self-determination and the fact that the Palestinians are not going anywhere has led to a policy where Israeli governments successively have believed that you can deal with the problem through containment and repression. That gives rise to cycles of violence that never stop and almost automatically does something to the Israeli body politic. So today, not only do you not have people who are issuing the warnings that Yeshayahu Leibovich did, you have the center of gravity in Israel's political system move far to the right. They are exemplified in particular by two ministers in the Israeli cabinet, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, but also increasingly in the power that the settler community, there are about 750,000 settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have come to have on Israeli politics. And that means that any accommodation between Israel and the Palestinians, which takes into account Israel's security and Palestinians' desire for self-determination, becomes even more remote a prospect. And so the question is, what does the occupation do to the Palestinians? That we know. What does the occupation do to the Israelis? That is the question that Leibovich is posing to us, or did pose to us.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that doesn't ever get any consideration because, at least in the West, because of the legit terrorist attack that was done against Israel on October 7th of last year was, heinous in its barbarity and what happened to these, especially to the civilian portion of the Israeli society that, highlighted by that music concert, et cetera, that anything is authorized in retaliation. We've had both President Biden and Vice President Harris at various times say, Israel has a right to defend itself, but it matters how. But they never actually say what how looks like or how that's supposed to work. And really, the first part is. And so the result has been that we say, well, we understand they were attacked. We understand 9/11, et cetera. But talking back about what's been happening in the decades prior to this, has that, I guess, supercharged Israel to be ready to use more violence to try to repress it, as opposed to trying any kind of accommodation to reach a political settlement?
No movement toward anything that Palestinians would regard as a substantive Palestinian state. What we have now is the West Bank, and about 60% of the West Bank, 40% is under exclusive Israeli control. In the rest of the West Bank, little chunks of Palestinian territory over which the Palestinian Authority has varying degrees of authority, to the point where it has become compromised and is seen by many Palestinians as Israel's enforcer. But to quickly change channels for a second, Danny, the standard line that one hears in the United States is, how can you blame Israel? It is surrounded by enemies that want to destroy it. But if you look at the Arab world, the main countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Republics, Jordan, none of these countries want to destroy Israel. Their position has been now for quite some time that meeting Palestinian aspirations for self-determination and pulling back to the 1967 lines means that they would be willing to recognize and accommodate and work with the state of Israel. Now, you might say Iran doesn't want Israel to exist, and perhaps Hamas, but the idea that Israel is surrounded by states, none of whom want it to exist, is simply not an accurate statement of fact.
I hear that a lot, the 1967 lines. What would that require Israel to give up that it currently has possession of? And is there any possibility that they would even consider that?
The second question I'll answer first. There is no possibility, alas, as far as I can see, given political trends in Israel today. What would they have to give up? Well, they would have to remove all the settlements from the West Bank.
And there's about 700,000 there, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
750,000 settlers, including in East Jerusalem. Now, people say to me when I say this is going to be difficult, well, there's only 750,000. Look, Ariel Sharon removed these settlements from Gaza in 2005. Why couldn't the same thing be done in the West Bank? The West Bank, for historical, cultural, and religious reasons, has a resonance, especially to Israelis on the far right, the religious parties, that cannot be compared with Gaza. So in Gaza, there is no equivalent of Jacob's tomb or Rachel's tomb, right? There's no equivalent of Jerusalem. Besides which, in the current political system, the settlers have become a very powerful element. They are members of the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, who live in the West Bank. So they'd have to deal with that. On top of that, they would have to deal with the Golan Heights, which they occupied in 1967. We, under President Trump, recognized that that is now part of Israel, but the Syrians never have. So there would be a significant amount of compromise required to achieve a movement back to the 67 lines. But I would hazard the guess, and I'll stop there, that even if the pullback were limited to just the evacuation of the settlements in the West Bank, the creation of a territorially contiguous Palestinian state, that would go a very, very long way toward meeting Palestinian aspirations.
Right. Yeah. And as you say, there's in this current environment, there's zero possibility that Netanyahu has emphatically said that would be handing a gift to the terrorists and giving them payment for that. So he won't even categorically has rejected that. But meanwhile, the situation continues to get worse. While everybody's focused on, like that headline Gary just tossed up there a second ago, while all the focus is on the current invasion of southern Lebanon and the potential for war, expanded war against Iran, which we're going to touch on in a second, the situation in Gaza continues to get worse. This was reported by Al Jazeera just earlier this morning. Gary, if you can toss that headline up there, that would be great. Thanks. As the source say that lots of patients and injured people are succumbing to their wounds due to the lack of essential medication because the Israeli military is still imposing significant restrictions on the flow of essential medical supplies to the north of the Gaza Strip. That's added to something that was in the New York Times last week, that 65 doctors and nurses and other medical professionals that have been helping in the Gaza Strip from the West over the last, year or so, I guess, they have come out and said, hey, we have seen the systematic attack of children, Palestinian children, from gunshot wounds to the head and the chest that look more like assassination shots. And it's from a significant number. 44 of them said that they saw lots of cases of preteen children who had been shot in the head. So all of this sounds like that Israel is doing everything it can to prevent any possibility of there being even the possibility of life living in Gaza Strip, even after the fighting goes on, which is given more impetus to saying, well, how about we just move them out, doing something else? That would seem obviously to undercut any possibility for a negotiated settlement, period. How do you see that?
Some background on northern Gaza. There is an Israeli retired general named Giora Eiland, and he recently said that, look, we should have cut a deal early on to get the hostages back. But since we have not, and since we are at war with Hamas, the only way of securing Israel against Hamas is essentially to sanitize northern Gaza, to make it clear of Hamas completely, to make it an Israeli military zone, and to achieve security that way. Now, it seems to me that what the Israelis have recently been telling the Gazans, 400,000 of them in northern Gaza, is to evacuate to safe zones. The Palestinians are reluctant, the Gazans are reluctant to do this because every time they have moved to a safe zone, those safe zones have been bombed. But in terms of Israeli thinking, I think the idea seems to be that the northern part of Gaza should be removed of all Gazans. There should be no food, water, or medicine allowed in. Since October 1, there have been almost no supplies allowed in. And that the long-term plan may be, and I can't say this for sure, but it would not surprise me, to either annex northern Gaza or to create it as a zone in which there are no Palestinians of any kind allowed.
Well, that's certainly not something that sounds like it's in America's interest, or that it even meets American vital needs. Now, you just mentioned there that I've seen that report also since October 1st, virtually nothing's getting in, even though the United States says that is a primary objective of ours to get in. There was a report out, I think that it actually hit a couple of weeks back, but from earlier this year, that the United States agency, I think it was the USAID, confirmed and corroborated, there was two separate reports, that Israel was blocking humanitarian aid, which violates American laws about you can't give weapons and ammunition to somebody if they're creating or they're causing humanitarian catastrophe with that. Well, here's an interesting comment from Secretary Blinken, who was asked that relatively recently about is America going to follow the law, and is that even happening? Here's what he said.
For us, this has been a constant area of emphasis, trying to make sure that they're getting the assistance that they desperately need. And we're intensely focused on that question now. And I have real concern about the inadequacy of the assistance that's getting to them. This is particularly true in the north, but not exclusively in the north. So we've been very directly engaged with Israel on the imperative of addressing the humanitarian needs of people in Gaza. And when it comes to the law, I'll simply repeat what I've said all along. We will apply the law. I have a continuous obligation to ensure that assistance we're providing is done in accordance with the law, whether it's the Leahy law, whether it's international humanitarian law, whether it's other things that we're responsible for. And I've also made clear, and we've made clear, that that's an ongoing responsibility and one that I take very seriously.
Yeah, but does he take it very seriously, Raj?
If you go to Prime Minister Netanyahu and say, I have real concerns about something, ask yourself what kind of response you're going to get from him on at a practical level. Is he going to do anything? No. Blinken says, I want to make sure that the law is applied. We know now, even based on internal memos written by the USAID Administrator Samantha Power, that there are systematic obstructions of relief convoys and food convoys. And we haven't done anything. So when Blinken says, well, I have real concerns about this, I'm going to make sure the law is applied, no one really believes him anymore, except perhaps people in the White House itself. I mean, in the wider world, it's clear that the interruption of supplies and various other actions the Israelis have taken, the United States is either going to gloss it over or just look the other way or even defend it.
And how does that meet with American national interest? Because I mean, it's got certain impact potentially in the upcoming presidential election, because there's lots of both Palestinian Americans as well as just any Americans from any stripe who care a lot about the Palestinian people who were suffering, like we just showed you here, and like these videos that Gary shows routinely here about wanton destruction throughout now the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But we don't seem to be doing anything about it. So is there any prospect that America's national interest will be, I guess, enforced?
So in the wider world, our narrative has been, or part of our narrative has been, is that there is a rules-based international order. And absent that, there will be total anarchy, and the United States is the guarantor of the rules-based international order. We've also made basic human rights a principle of our foreign policy, at least in a narrative sense. What has happened in Gaza and what is happening in Lebanon now makes people, at the very least, cynical when they hear the claims of universal rights and universal laws. So that's one problem. The second problem is that if the Israelis decide that the way they want to deal with the Palestinian problem is through occupation and containment, and that they are not willing to move toward a two-state solution. You mentioned Netanyahu's statement. He said flat out, there will not be a Palestinian state. In 2018, the Knesset passed a basic law, legislation that has constitutional significance, that said that between the river and the sea, that is the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, self-determination is unique to the Israeli people. So it is very clear now that the train of the two-state solution has left the station. So we have to ask ourselves, if it is occupation, containment, and repression, is it in our interest not only to be involved in such a policy, but indeed to enable it?
And let me just point blank ask, what should be, we'll not say what is, because I guess what is in America's interest is what's actually transpiring on the ground. What should be America's interest in this entire conflict?
Well, you can't, first of all, provide, I think it's about $16.9 billion in military aid to Israel and say that all the civilian casualties that have occurred, so about 42,000 people in Gaza have died, about 16, 17,000 of them are estimated to be men and women. Let's say that the total was only half that, because everyone who defends Israel says, well, it's been exaggerated. These weapons ultimately are our weapons, so we cannot dissociate ourselves from what is going on in Gaza and what is taking place in Lebanon. Now, we'll come to Lebanon in a minute, but there is the potential for a Gaza-ification, if you will, of Lebanon as well, if the war there ratchets up, which it looks like it's going to do.
And right. So what should America's policy be?
Well,
if we're going to take a policy that's going to benefit the United States long term, not just in the immediate time, what should we do?
The only thing that will immediately get the attention of the Israeli government would be for a president to say, unless X, Y, or Z happens, delivery of humanitarian aid, reduction of civilian casualties, negotiation toward a two-state solution, unless that happens, we will begin to make our assistance, military and economic, conditional on your compliance on these fronts. But I will submit to you that I cannot imagine any president whether it's President Harris or a return of President Trump, doing anything like that. I think the possibilities, given the nature of the American political system, the degree to which the Israeli narrative on what the problem is believed by the American public, given the powerful groups that back Israel and the United States, both Jewish and non-Jewish, I should add. So the evangelical Christians are a good example. I think the Palestinians have the deck stacked against them in this country. Their voice at the table of American politics is far, far weaker than the Israeli voice. So I would say, Danny, that if you're a betting man, don't put a lot of money on hoping that there'll be a significant change in American policy.
Yeah,
But, but what
I
that
actually
means,
don't think that there will be any at all, which leads me to my next question then. What is the consequence of the United States if we keep going down this path where we have, like the Secretary of State just, made this statement that we care about the rule of law when all of our actions scream that we don't? What is the consequence of following along that path?
well, I have a friend whom you know very well. He's been on this program, who's now at the moment giving lectures in Doha, Qatar. And he wrote to me today and he said, not only are people just kind of rolling their eyes when they hear about universal human rights and the rules based international order being the cornerstones of American foreign policy, there is downright anger at the fact that we are seen as active enablers of what is going on in Gaza and what is ratcheting up in Lebanon. So one could say it's not just cynicism about American values, but increasing anger at American values. And if you take the Muslim world as a whole, I think it's a fair statement that that view is widely shared there. Now, you could say, well, we don't care about the rest of the world. We just pursue what our interests are. But at every turn, our own diplomats tell us that we do care about what the rest of the world thinks. So if you want to have a kind of principled foreign policy that has purchase in the rest of the world, you can't on a daily basis in certain parts of the world do things that flatly contradict those principles. People are not idiots. They see through this.
I'll argue here that there's additional and even more near-term risks to continuing to ignore any of these what should be American values and interests, and instead submission to what Benjamin Netanyahu wants to do, and that is that we could get drawn into a war. Now, you talk about kind of the American body politic and some of the major news media that covers this. You may have seen this. There was a former, I think it was Trump administration official that made some pretty damning comments in a tweet the other day. This is a guy, Matthew Broderick. I wanted to show this first because this is his biography. This shows this guy has an incredible resume here. He's experienced in U.S. foreign policy and working in the State Department, Department of Defense, National Security Council on Iran, Syria, and Palestine, etc. Was the White House Palestinian-Israeli peace team on political aspects at one point. So you see that you get the point. This guy's got a lot of experience inside the White House at the highest levels of policymaking in America. And this is the tweet that he sent out a couple of days ago. Israel should carpet bomb the Irish area and then napalm all over it. And what that's referring to, if many of you are not aware of, is there was some UN peacekeepers that were from Ireland that the Israelis didn't like, and that they wanted them. They gave them some evacuation orders, and he said, if they don't leave, then we should kill them all. I mean, when you hear that kind of stuff from people who were at the top of our government, that's kind of an alarming development.
Absolutely. And such sentiments, by the way, are echoed not only among American supporters of Israel here, some of whom, by the way, do Israel a great disservice because they are encouraging its worst instincts. You hear it within the Israeli right as well. It's very, very common. Let me just add that the confrontations that have occurred between the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and UNIFIL, the UN monitoring deployment in southern Lebanon, has created a great deal of concern in the Arab world, in parts of the West, and that is not playing well either. I think Netanyahu would rather have no observers of any kind in southern Lebanon because he would then have a free hand to do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I'm sure that he would. So that's from a former official. Now we have the current administration official. I'm now shifting a little bit further north and talking again about the possibility of us getting dragged into a wider war against Iran, because there's a lot of developments been happening even in the last 36 hours. You have President Harris was Vice President Harris, sorry, perhaps a Freudian slip of what may come next. She has said in a recent interview that it was Iran, not China, not Russia, is America's #1 adversary. And she emphasized that we need to do whatever it takes to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power. That is one of my highest priorities, implying that she would use military force should she become the commander in chief. So when you take about, what happened with Brodsky's comments here, and by the way, I could have also shown a clip from, former President Trump basically doing backflips to say how he would, absolutely, Israel should hit Iran. That's what they should do for sure. Hit the nuclear sites, and we'll worry about it later. When you hear these kinds of things, again, looking at it from the lens of what is or what should be America's national interest, do you have concerns that we're moving towards conflict?
Absolutely. So let's take the issue of Iran can never have nuclear weapons. Our non-proliferation policy basically boils down to this. We can have nuclear weapons. And by the way, if you're a friend of ours and we think you can behave responsibly and have nuclear weapons, you can have nuclear weapons too. So back in the day, in 1974, when the Indians tested their first nuclear device, they were ostracized and put under sanctions. But now a nuclear India is just fine. Nuclear Iran is not. But here's the thing. We addressed the problem diplomatically. You may remember in 2015, we had an agreement signed between the United States, Iran, and some other countries called the JCPOA, the Joint Program of Action. It provided for on-site inspection of Iranian nuclear facilities, electronic verification. It dismantled 2/3 of Iran's centrifuges. Those are things that spin uranium and make it enriched. They shipped the agreement provided for shipping 25,000 pounds of uranium outside Iran and limited Iran to 3.6% enrichment of uranium. President Trump, egged on, by the way, by Bibi Netanyahu, scrapped that agreement. And now we say we're terrified at the prospect of a nuclear Iran. We had an agreement. It was not a perfect agreement. There's no such thing as a perfect arms control agreement, but we had an agreement that we ourselves torpedoed. The Biden administration did not re-sign it. And so we had that solution. We had that problem under control. Now we have maneuvered ourselves in a position where we say, if there's an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, and that accelerates Iran's movement toward nuclear weapons, rather than allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, we will be at war with Iran. That is a very dangerous proposition, I might submit.
Yeah, and then that gives them every incentive in the world to actually give one. If they haven't had one so far, and by the way, Gary, if you could pull that full screen up there about the Iranian parliament has recently publicly been saying, hey, you know what? Let's revoke that fatwa that the Ayatollah previously signed that says that they banned nuclear weapons. Now they're saying, hey, this may be the only thing that can protect us. So you see there that that's the evidence that very thing is starting to happen already. And in fact, back to your other point there about war, here is a former ambassador Sales was asked, what should we do about the Iranians? Should we help Israel go after them or not? Here's what he said.
Israel has to hit Iran hard. We've now gone through 2 rocket and missile and drone attacks that Iran has launched directly on Israeli territory, and Israel cannot afford for this kind of aggression to become the new normal. So what Israel has to do is restore deterrence. And what that means is they're going to have to hit something that really matters to the mullahs in Tehran. Now, is that the nuclear program? Not necessarily, but they're going to have to target military assets, maybe energy infrastructure, to send a clear signal to Tehran. If you hit us, we can hit you harder and hurt you more and cause them to stand down.
You know, when I hear stuff like that, Raj, there's never any consideration to what the reaction could be. What do you think is the possibility for Iran to get the message, as he put it, and stand down?
Well, here's the message that Iran has received. They have said, in the event that Israel attacks Iran, not only its nuclear facilities, but anything else, there will be no red lines. Now, you could say they're bluffing, but do you want to be in a world where Israel attacks Iran in retaliation? And let's even say that they don't attack their nuclear facilities. We can come, by the way, to the question of just how difficult it would be. Almost certainly, the Iranians would retaliate. We now have an American missile crew, 100 people, manning a THAAD system, a high altitude missile defense system. Imagine that in the event of an Iranian retaliation, either in round one or round two, because it will continue, one or more of those American missile crew members were to be killed. What might then happen? Is it inevitable that we would get pulled into a war with Iran? No, nothing is inevitable. Is it much more likely? Yes. I absolutely think that is where we are. So no one should have any doubt that if there's an Israeli retaliation, the Iranians are going to launch a counter retaliation. So the question is, what is the end game? What would be the definition of success in the strike and counterstrike from the standpoint of the Israelis and from the standpoint of the United States?
Right, and that's what we're trying to figure out here, and what's a course forward. It seems like the administration's trying to find the course. I would say thread the needle, but I think it's more like seeking to be kind of pregnant, but not all the way pregnant. And I think our policies are having about as much success as anyone would try to do that. Here's a different view. Former Admiral Stavridis. And I think that he's going to be talking here. I want you to think as you watch this clip here. I'm not sure that his understanding of where the Iranians are right now is really that valid. Watch this.
I think Iran has awoken and smelled the tea in the Middle East, which is to say they're realizing the reach and the power and the authority of Israel. The unbroken string of success over the last couple of months by Israel against the terrorists, Hamas and Hezbollah, quite striking. That's penetrated. And as a result, Iran is pedaling furiously to try and restrain Israel. This gets us to the U.S. role. I think the U.S. will try and ensure Israel doesn't strike major civilian targets, doesn't strike the nuclear sites, doesn't strike the energy. So first role for the U.S. is discussions about what to do. And then secondly, where I think you're going with the question, Michael, we almost certainly will be providing intelligence, cybersecurity overwatch. Our aircraft carriers will be in the region as backup. But I think in the end, this strike is going to be conducted by Israel for Israelis.
Yeah, but enabled by the United States. He sort of left that part out, even though he just described it. But is that where Iran is? Have they, quote, smelled the tea leaves now, and that they're afraid because they've seen how good Israel is? I think they already knew how good and strong Israel was, and I think that's one of the reasons they've been deterred, as they have been for decades, really. But now that if you're talking about you strike something and hit it hard, what is the risk that Iran finally says, even though you're strong, we're going to strike back because we also have some cards to play?
Right. So let's go back to the world as seen by Admiral Stavridis, at least the Middle East as seen by Admiral Stavridis. The burden of his argument is that the Israelis have hit Hamas and Hezbollah so hard, and they now have the capability to hit Iran, that the minds have been concentrated in Iran and that the mullahs have gotten the message. But is that necessarily the message they received? A year after Hamas's attack on Israel, Hamas is not yet destroyed. There is a division within the Israeli national security establishment between those who say it can and must be destroyed, Netanyahu and far-right ministers, and others who say it cannot be destroyed. Hamas still manages to fire missiles into Israel. Now, in terms of Lebanon, yes, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was a serious blow. The loss of some senior commanders was a serious blow. But Israel has gone now from airstrikes into what looks like a full-on ground campaign. As you know, as a former soldier, Danny, that is going to be a very dangerous move, because if there's one thing Hezbollah has prepared for over the years, is an Israeli ground invasion. And I can't tell you who will succeed and who will not succeed, but I can tell you two things. Based on the past, 1982 to 2000, when Israel invaded and had to pull out, and Hezbollah arose from that battle between Israel and the Lebanese, and what happened in 2006, a month-long standoff where again the Israelis withdrew. It is not at all clear to me that a ground campaign will break the back of Hamas. They've been preparing for it. They have underground tunnels. They've stored equipment. They have missiles that can move underground and shoot from underground. And as for the losses of these key personnel, there is a doctrine within Hezbollah that when you are in a senior position, you automatically groom your successor, because you have to assume that you could be killed. So the idea that killing this or that person is some death blow as opposed to a significant setback that will be overcome, I think that's just pure foolishness. So we're at the very early stages of the game. So as Iran sees it, the world may look very different than the way Admiral Stavridis and a lot of people in Washington see it.
Right. And when there's a couple of things that go along with that, is that the Israeli economy has been badly hurt by the last year of war. And now then you're talking about mobilizing more reservists, and that's going to cause more damage, more loss to their tourism industry, which continues to be hampered. And it's not at all clear that they're going to be able to project this power. And even in the Lebanon, I want to look at that for just a second. You just mentioned something about what the Hezbollah side is doing. I found this video clip. I want to show you just a piece of it here, because this was from an Israeli soldier who has, in some of the early places where they have captured some territory in southern Lebanon, and they show actually what's inside of some of these. Watch this.
Air Force bombings. As we enter this tunnel, you can see it's a front post for Hezbollah warriors to bunker down and wait for their operation to attack Israeli settlements. You see it's fortified from above to block any Air Force bombings. The size of it is around 2 meters by 3 meters. You can take a look. And what we found inside this tiny bunker is astonishing. We have here this blue barrel. It's filled with water so that Hezbollah warriors can bunker down here for a long time. We found here another blue barrel like this. And follow me outside to see what we found inside the barrel. We've just exited the frontline bunker, which is 5 meters above my left shoulder. You can see it in this direction. We've unloaded these 2 big blue barrels that were designed to protect all the ammunition here from the rain and allow Hezbollah fighters to stay here for a long time. What you can see here is different types of gear. You have fighter vests that were loaded with magazines. You have thermal lenses. You have different types of weapons, automatic rifles. Here you got uniforms and boots and helmets. And here you have this long-range rifle called a PK that had ammunition loaded into its barrel. Here's all different types of ammunition, magazines, and that were full. Here you can even see the medical equipment that proves to us that Hezbollah fighters not only want to attack our settlements, but they want to treat their wounded and come back home safely.
Yeah, what a strange thing that they want to come back home safely. But that just shows there are literally probably thousands of those kinds of small squad-size elements that they're have throughout the southern Lebanon, even actually all the way up into some areas near Beirut. So this is a substantial honeycomb of operations. And the thing about this is that it's commensurate to your comment there about the leadership. Down on the lower levels, they have a situation to where they have standing orders. So if they lose all communication with everybody, if the leaders get taken out, they still know what to do in their platoon strong point, if you want to use that terminology there. And these things are going to have to be rooted out. And you see, they're equipped to stay a long time without getting resupplies.
Right. Couple of points, if I might, Danny. So you remember the publicity that was given to the booby trapping of Hamas's pagers and walkie-talkies? Right. Well, those pagers and walkie-talkies are not used by Hamas fighters, people who are actually engaged in combat. Because Hamas is a political party, it's a paramilitary group of a substantial nature, but it's also a social service agency, a quasi-government. And so there are Hamas personnel who are not involved in the military aspects of things, who use these communication devices. No hardened Hamas soldier is going to use pagers and walkie-talkies. They have a very secure communication system. That's point number one. Point number two, about the video that you just put on the screen, it's not just bunkers where soldiers can hide out and have food and rest and stock ammunition. There is a vast network of underground tunnels through which not just jeeps and cars, but even trucks can go through, and that missiles can be moved and fired from underground, right? So just on Sunday, I believe, there were 175 rockets fired into northern Israel. And starting from about 12 a.m., 12:01 a.m. today, about 75. I was just listening to a podcast from Israel. And one of the things the person said at the beginning is, we're going to begin this podcast, but we may have to interrupt it because if there are air raid warnings, we will have to go into shelters. So there is a state of kind of anxiety. In northern Israel, the people who have left, about 60,000, maybe 70,000, have not been able to go back, nor will they ever be. And we're just at the beginning of this ground campaign. It is going to be a long and bloody business. And the IDF, which now has a full-scale war going on in Gaza, is now taking on Hezbollah, which is a much, much more powerful political force and military force. It's a much tougher customer militarily.
Right, and they still have conflict in the West Bank, which uses a lot. Even the IDF engages there. Of course, there's periodic strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, against targets in Syria, some even against some militia forces in Iraq, etc. And now then we're talking about the possibility of expanding this north. So in the last few minutes that we have here, I wonder if you can just kind of, and I know you hate to do this, but use your crystal ball, or better yet, tell me what is the range of what you think is the possible things that could come in the next phase? Because I think, by all accounts, Israel is going to do something to Iran. I think they painted themselves into a corner and they can't do nothing. But if it's something that's like a little bit, a medium size, or a big strike, what is the possible next steps by Iran, and where is this going?
Right. Like I suspect you have been, I've been puzzled that the Israelis have taken as long as they have to retaliate, because usually they retaliate quickly, and their concept of deterrence is you deter the other party by hitting back twice as hard. They haven't, but they almost certainly will. The only question is, what will the targets be? So let's take the possibility of a target like the energy facilities just of Iran. Iran produces about 3.2 million barrels of oil a day. That's about 3% of total world production. And so you might say, well, that's not going to be very much. But it's not. That statistic is misleading, because you have to take into account the degree to which markets worldwide, the global oil markets, will be rattled. What that will do to the price of oil very, very quickly. And it would also have a significant impact on Israel, because 92%, perhaps more, of all the oil it uses is imported, right? That's the economic consequence. On the military side, there will almost certainly be an Iranian retaliation, and I think it'll be a much more severe retaliation than the last one was. Even the last one, by the way, only about 10% of the missiles got through, but you may know that Nevatim Air Base was struck, and a lot of hangars and buildings were destroyed. If there's a much bigger barrage, is it possible that more of them will get through? Yes. So we don't know where this is going, but it's not going in any good place as far as I can tell.
And is there an off ramp? Is there any way that this gets that Israel can have a low enough threshold that Iran could be convinced that, all right, this don't go any further? Or frankly, is that even anything Netanyahu wants? Because I'll just tell you from my observation, it looks like that the Israeli government, and led by Netanyahu, wants to get rid of their Palestinian problem, their Hezbollah problem, and their Iran problem, while they had this, quote, golden opportunity. How do you see that?
My read on Netanyahu and the people to his right, and there are such people, is that they believe that the fundamental problem has been Iran, that this is a golden opportunity and they should hit very hard. A former Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, said the other day, and he was almost advising Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is a chance, we have to finish off Iran. So I don't think there's any prospect, Danny, of a kind of gnat bite-like Israeli response. It'll be a very significant response. And then at that point, when the Iranian homeland is hit, the Iranians will have to retaliate. The question then becomes, what do the Israelis do? And what do the Iranians do? And at what point does this conflict spiral begin to spin out of control? And at what point might we be forced, even against our will and best interest, to get involved in this? So I, like you, am not hopeful for a good outcome, and I'm very worried about where this is going. As we've said before when I was on your show last time, it's relatively easy to start a war, but to manage it and move it in the direction that you want to go, there's an enormous amount of human hubris about this, that we can control war, but sometimes war controls us.
Yeah, we certainly have a lot of recent experience with that, and does not bode quite well for the future. But listen, all we can do is continue to shine a light of truth onto this so that people are aware of what's at stake here, and just have to really hope that maybe even enough pressure can be brought to bear on some of our leaders that can say, hey, get this thing off the front burner, get the fire out, so that we don't get sucked into a war. Because, man, if the Iraq war was bad, I can assure you it's nothing compared to what a war against Iran would be. But let's hope we don't have to find that out. But in any case, we really appreciate you coming on today and using a lot of your background and your knowledge to shine a light on this. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Danny. My pleasure.
And also to let you know, we got one more show to come to you guys. A lot of other things going on in the Indo-Pacific. We don't want to ignore that, because that also has a lot of implications for American national security. We're going to have Lyle Goldstein on, Dr. Goldstein. He's going to come on to explain to us some of the significance of 125 aircraft, Chinese aircraft, were buzzing around the island of Taiwan. We're going to see what that means, and we should be a little bit more worried about that. We'll see that today at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. So be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and join us for Daniel Davis Deep Dive at 3:30.